May 2025. The skies over South Asia were on fire. Operation Sindoor, 96 hours. More than 125 fighter jets, cruise missiles, armed drones, and the closest the world had come to a nuclear flashpoint since the Cold War. Pakistan and India, two nations that together hold over 300 nuclear warheads, were locked in direct military confrontation for the first time since 1971, and the world held its breath. But when the guns fell silent, a different question began echoing through every intelligence agency, every war room, every think tank on the planet. Pakistan did not use nuclear weapons. Why? How close did it actually get? And what has changed in Pakistan's nuclear command structure since those 96 hours ended? Today, we answer those questions. This is War and Military History, and this is the story of the most consequential shift in South Asian nuclear architecture in 25 years.
Before we get into what changed, we need to understand what we're actually talking about. A nuclear weapon is not a rifle. You cannot simply hand it to a general and tell him to use his judgment. Every nuclear-armed state on Earth maintains what is called a command, control, communications, and intelligence system, or C3I. This is the architecture that decides who has the authority to authorize a nuclear strike, under what conditions, and through what chain of command. There are three core principles that every credible nuclear C3I system must satisfy. First, civilian authority. The decision to use nuclear weapons must rest with political leadership, not military commanders acting alone. Second, negative control. The system must ensure that weapons cannot be used accidentally, by mistake, or without proper authorization. Third, positive control. Even after a devastating first strike by the enemy, the system must be able to absorb the blow and still deliver a credible response. This is what strategists call second strike capability. Fail on any one of these three, and your nuclear deterrent collapses. Either your weapons go off when they shouldn't, or they can't fire when you need them, or the enemy simply doesn't believe you'll use them. Pakistan established its formal nuclear command architecture in the year 2000, when the National Command Authority, the NCA, was created. And for 25 years, that structure remained largely unchanged, until Operation Sindoor. Let's look at how Pakistan's nuclear command system was structured before May 2025. At the top sits the National Command Authority, the NCA. This is the supreme body that oversees all matters related to Pakistan's nuclear weapons. The NCA has two main committees. The Employment Control Committee. This is the decision-making body. It decides when, how, and under what conditions nuclear weapons may be used. It is chaired by the Prime Minister. Members include the Foreign Minister, the Defense Minister, the Chairman Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the chiefs of all three military services. The Development Control Committee. This body oversees the research, development, production, and storage of nuclear weapons and delivery systems. It is also chaired by the Prime Minister. Supporting both committees is the Strategic Plans Division, the SPD, which functions as the Secretariat of the NCA. The SPD handles day-to-day management, security protocols, and operational readiness of Pakistan's nuclear arsenal. On paper, this is a robust system. Civilian leadership at the top, military expertise integrated throughout, and a dedicated bureaucracy to keep everything running. But theory and reality are two different things, and Operation Sindoor tested that reality in ways no war game ever could. It began in the early hours of May 7th, 2025.
Indian cruise missiles and precision-guided munitions struck multiple targets inside Pakistani territory. The stated justification was retaliation for a terrorist attack in Indian-administered Kashmir that New Delhi blamed on Pakistan-based groups. Pakistan's response was immediate, coordinated, and devastating. In what became the largest aerial engagement since the Second World War, Pakistani forces engaged Indian aircraft, destroyed Indian drones, and launched retaliatory strikes of their own. But beneath the thunder of conventional warfare, something else was happening. According to multiple credible sources, as Indian missiles continued to land on Pakistani soil, including strikes near sensitive military installations, Pakistan's National Command Authority convened an emergency session. Every option was on the table, including options that the world prays never move from theory to practice. Pakistan ultimately chose restraint. Why? Because Pakistan's nuclear doctrine is built on a concept called full-spectrum deterrence. Nuclear weapons are the last resort, not the first. And in this crisis, Pakistan's conventional military response was proving sufficient. But here is the critical point. The system worked. The NCA met. The chain of command held. Civilian and military leadership were in communication, and the decision not to escalate was made deliberately, rationally, through a structured process, not in chaos. That mattered enormously. But it also exposed something. The speed of modern warfare had compressed decision-making timelines in ways the architects of Pakistan's nuclear system in the year 2000 had never anticipated. 96 hours is not a lot of time when nuclear weapons are in the equation. And so, when the ceasefire came, Pakistan's leadership began asking hard questions about how to make the system even more robust, more credible, and more capable of functioning under extreme pressure. The answers came in two forms. The first answer was legal. Pakistan passed its 27th constitutional amendment, a historic move that gave the National Security Committee constitutional status for the first time. Let's be clear about what this means, because it is more significant than it might appear. Before the amendment, Pakistan's nuclear command structures existed as executive arrangements, important, but ultimately subject to change by any government that chose to reorganize them. After the amendment, the core of Pakistan's national security decision-making architecture is embedded in the constitution itself. It cannot be dismantled by a simple cabinet reshuffle. It cannot be quietly reorganized by a new prime minister. Any fundamental change requires a constitutional majority. The practical implications for nuclear command are threefold. First, the chain of authority for nuclear decisions is now legally defined and legally protected. In a crisis, there is no ambiguity about who has the power to decide. Second, the convening of national security decision-making bodies in a crisis is now a constitutional requirement, not a matter of political choice. Third, and perhaps most importantly for international audiences, this is Pakistan's message to the world that its nuclear weapons are governed by a stable, accountable, institutionalized system, not by the whims of any individual, not by the pressures of any single crisis. For a country that has faced persistent questions in Western capitals about the security and command of its nuclear arsenal, this amendment is a direct and deliberate response.
The second answer was institutional, and it sent shockwaves through every strategic capital on Earth.
General Asim Munir was promoted to the rank of Field Marshal. To understand why this matters, you need to understand what Field Marshal means in the Pakistani military context. This is not an honorary title handed out at retirement ceremonies. In Pakistan's military tradition, a Field Marshal holds a permanent commission. He does not retire.
He remains a serving officer of the armed forces for life. The last time Pakistan conferred this rank was in 1965, when Ayub Khan promoted himself to Field Marshal following the Indo-Pakistani War. That was 60 years ago. So why now? And what does it mean for nuclear command? The answer has two dimensions. The first is strategic continuity. Under normal circumstances, a Pakistani army chief serves a 3-year term and then retires. With each change of chief, there is inevitably some adjustment in military posture, in relationships, in institutional memory. That turnover creates vulnerability, particularly in a protracted standoff with India, where both sides are constantly reading signals. By making Asim Munir a field marshal, Pakistan has created a permanent presence at the apex of its military establishment, a figure whose authority transcends any normal rotation of command. This provides a kind of strategic continuity that is genuinely new in Pakistan's institutional history. The second dimension is credibility. In a nuclear standoff, signaling matters as much as capability. The other side needs to believe that your deterrent is real, that your chain of command is stable, and that the person at the top of that chain will not be replaced in 6 months. A field marshal who serves for life sends a very different signal than a general who retires on schedule. Critics, and there are legitimate critics, raise a different concern. Does a permanent military figure at the apex of the national security structure complicate civil-military balance? Does it shift too much authority away from elected civilian leadership? These are not trivial questions, and Pakistan's history gives them weight. But the counter-argument is equally serious. In a world where Pakistan faces an adversary with a significantly larger conventional military, and where the speed of modern warfare allows for escalation within hours rather than days, having a figure of unquestioned authority and institutional permanence at the center of nuclear decision-making may be exactly what deterrence requires.
Now let's talk about the doctrine itself. Before Operation Sindoor, Pakistan's nuclear doctrine rested on what analysts described as 4 red lines, thresholds that, if crossed by India, would put nuclear weapons into active consideration. The first threshold was existential military defeat. If India destroyed so much of Pakistan's conventional military capability that the state itself was at risk. The second was economic strangulation. If India imposed a naval blockade that cut Pakistan off from the global economy. The third was political decapitation. If India targeted Pakistan's civilian or military leadership directly. The fourth was territorial conquest. If Indian forces seized a significant enough portion of Pakistani territory to fundamentally alter the strategic balance. During Operation Sindoor, India approached some of these thresholds, but it did not cross them. And Pakistan's response, devastating in conventional terms, made clear that crossing them would have consequences. Now, the question is whether those thresholds have shifted since May 2025. What we can say, based on available evidence, is this. Pakistan appears to be in an active internal debate about whether sustained aerial bombardment of its military infrastructure should be treated as approaching a red line, even if ground forces are not involved. The strikes during Operation Sindoor came dangerously close to certain sensitive facilities, and that has clearly shaped internal thinking. Whether this results in a formal doctrinal revision remains to be seen, but the intellectual groundwork appears to be underway. Here is something that deserves more attention than it has received. When 2 nuclear-armed states with a combined population of nearly 2 billion people went to war in May 2025, the world's major powers said very little publicly. The United States made private diplomatic contacts. China called for restraint from both sides. Russia said almost nothing. The United Nations Security Council met
but issued no binding resolution. Why? Part of the answer is geopolitical. China has equities on both sides. The United States was navigating its own complex relationships with both Islamabad and New Delhi. But part of the answer, a larger part than most analysts have acknowledged, is that the major powers looked at Pakistan's nuclear command system and concluded that it was functioning as designed, that the NCA was in session, that civilian authority was being exercised, that the chain of command was intact. When nuclear weapons are governed by a credible, stable, institutionalized system, outside powers have less reason to panic and intervene. When they see gaps, when they worry about rogue actors, unauthorized use, or command breakdown, that is when you get emergency hotline calls, back-channel ultimatums, and potential external pressure that compromises sovereignty. Pakistan's nuclear command held during Operation Sindoor, and the world, watching carefully, took note. The 27th Amendment and the Field Marshal appointment are, in part, Pakistan's effort to ensure that next time, if there is a next time, that confidence is even more deeply institutionalized.
No analysis of Pakistan's nuclear command is complete without looking at the other side. India's official nuclear doctrine is built on no first use, a commitment not to use nuclear weapons unless India itself is struck by nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons first. For decades, this doctrine shaped the strategic environment in South Asia. It gave Pakistan a certain assurance that India would not launch a nuclear first strike, no matter how severe the conventional conflict. But cracks have been appearing in that assurance. Since 2016, multiple senior Indian officials, including a former defense minister, have publicly questioned whether no first use should remain Indian policy. The argument from hawks in New Delhi is that Pakistan's tactical nuclear weapons, designed for battlefield use against advancing Indian ground forces, have effectively nullified India's conventional military advantage. If Pakistan can threaten to use small nuclear weapons to stop an Indian armored advance, and India is bound by no first use, then India's massive conventional superiority becomes strategically less relevant. Operation Sindoor has intensified this debate inside India. Some voices in New Delhi are now arguing that Pakistan's demonstrated nuclear command stability, ironically, makes India's strategic problem worse. A Pakistan with a credible, functioning nuclear system that is willing to stand firm under military pressure is a Pakistan that India cannot simply overwhelm with conventional force. This debate in India matters for Pakistan's nuclear planners. Because if India ever formally abandons no first use, the entire deterrence equation in South Asia shifts, and both sides will need to recalibrate. So where does this leave us? Pakistan's nuclear command system emerged from Operation Sindoor stronger, more institutionalized, and more internationally credible than it was before. The 27th Constitutional Amendment has anchored the decision-making architecture in law. The Field Marshal appointment has created a permanent center of gravity in military command, and the NCA's performance during the crisis itself demonstrated that the system can function under real-world pressure, not just in theory. But the challenges ahead are formidable. The speed of modern warfare is accelerating. Hypersonic missiles, artificial intelligence-assisted targeting, and drone swarms are compressing the time available for human decision-makers. The 96 hours of Operation Sindoor may be a luxury that future crises do not afford. The civil-military balance question remains genuinely unresolved. Pakistan's democratic institutions are still fragile, and a permanent military figure at the center of the national security architecture carries risks as well as benefits. And the broader regional environment is deteriorating. India's military modernization is continuing at pace. The line of control remains volatile.
and the underlying political dispute over Kashmir has not moved an inch toward resolution. What Operation Sindoor proved is that Pakistan's deterrent is real, its command is functional, and its military is capable of standing up to one of the largest armies in the world. What it also proved is that this region remains the most dangerous nuclear flashpoint on Earth. And the next crisis, if it comes, may not end as cleanly as this one did.
You are watching War and Military History, where every conflict has a cause, every border has a cost, and every war leaves something behind. Subscribe and stay with us, because history is never truly over.